Hey everybody, this is Adam B. Levine from Let's Talk Bitcoin. We had so many new show submissions for the contest, we've opted to create a page where you can listen to all of them at your own pace. Visit letstalkbitcoin.com/contest to peruse the entire set, and feel free to vote for more than one. We'll be selecting multiple shows to join the network in Q1. Enjoy the show, and remember to vote at letstalkbitcoin.com/contest.
Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Bit Countdown. Bit Countdown is a podcast counting down the 5 most interesting and important stories from this week in Bitcoin news and discussing the topics from the perspective of a Bitcoin advocate and a Bitcoin naysayer. With us today is Chris Stevens, Bitcoin enthusiast and mastermind behind the show.
Hello.
We also have Ben Geely, Bitcoin skeptic and one of the many voices of insanity behind 5secondfilms.com.
Skeptic is harsh.
I'm Sean Stevens, software engineer, entrepreneur, and moderator for this discussion, and also with us today is Dave Mancherjay, our producer. Today we discuss Snoop Dogg, buying expensive sports cars, Apple's problem with Bitcoin apps, Bank of America's take on a fair price for Bitcoin, and, of course, China. Before we get going, in the interest of full disclosure, both Chris and I have Bitcoin investments. Ben does not.
I might have some soon, though. You never know.
Never know. The current Bitstamp price for Bitcoin is $8.89. Let's get started. All right, story number 1. Snoop Dogg thinks highly of Bitcoin. This week, Snoop Dogg, aka Snoop Lion, tweeted out to the world, "My next record available on Bitcoin and delivered in a drone." Both Coinbase and BitPay were quick to take Snoop up on the offer, and Snoop tweeted back saying that he wants to make it happen. Afterwards, Mel B, a.k.a. Scary Spice, and Donald Glover, a.k.a. Troy Barnes, a.k.a. Childish Gambino, expressed interest in accepting Bitcoin for their albums. So, guys, is an endorsement from Snoop Dogg significant in the Bitcoin world? And do you think other artists will follow Mel B and Donald Glover?
I think so. I think it's significant. I mean, he is introducing that concept to artists in general. And I mean, it's Snoop Dogg, huge influence on everyone. So I think that, I mean, it already gained traction in the media, and I think it is a big deal. And you saw Mel B and you saw Donald Glover already endorse it as well. So I think that that is important, and I think it's going to lead the way for other artists to do the same, or at least look into doing the same.
I mean, yeah, God knows the music industry follows every breathless uttering of Mel B. Not to sound like a sarcastic there. No, but I do agree with you, Chris. That makes a lot of sense in terms of introducing the concept out to a wider, less technical savvy audience. It definitely raises the profile of Bitcoin. Whether it has any actual meaningful impact on the usage of Bitcoin outside of a select group of people who are weed and or rap enthusiasts who also happen to be very into Bitcoin, I would be highly skeptical.
Do you think it could lead to independent artists adopting it more?
What is the advantage for an independent artist over just accepting dollars?
So say you could accept Bitcoin, you could have your own Bitcoin address and say, hey, buy my CD, donate to this address, here's my CD. Or you could sign up with Coinbase and you don't have to pay higher percentages on your, on like a credit card fee or a PayPal fee or whatever.
So, yeah, I understand that it alters transaction fees, essentially. But for the average independent musician, I think that the abstraction of converting dollars back and forth from a, moving commodity price is probably more trouble than dealing with relatively insignificant transaction fees on the lower end.
Well, I don't know, because bands could accept smaller donations, like 99-cent donations or even 50-cent donations, where right now, if through PayPal, like a good chunk of that's going to get taken out. Like if someone wanted to just donate to them on the road to help buy them lunch.
Sure. I don't disagree with you there. I question the utility for your average guy in a band. And again, you still have to, at least right now, convert back and forth and do so at a rate at which you're like, okay, I've made my money, or whether you want to start kind of gambling with the donation they gave to you as to the continued upward valuation of a Bitcoin. So it's neat to be sure, but I don't see how it's going to help your average kind of musician. In fact, I would make an argument that if anyone is getting more publicity out of it, it's Snoop Dogg and Childish Gambino and Mel B, because they're mentioning something that's hot in a certain segment of the tech world, as well as a way of associating themselves with like high tech concepts, which is an extremely attractive thing for a lot of entertainment focused folks these days.
Do you think any of them will actually adopt it?
Well, I don't think any of them really will care. If Snoop Dogg remembers tweeting this, and God loves Snoop Lion, but if he remembers tweeting this, I'm sure he'll tell someone down the record chain line to handle it. And if he continues to remember it persistently enough that it actually is something that happens, then yes. But I would bet that the relative percentage of usage is going to be pretty damn low.
I'm actually more excited about the drone aspect personally.
He's gonna
I would buy a Snoop Dogg album delivered by drone.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to see some sort of like weed-powered drone come and bring me a Snoop Lion album, just like puttering through the air, squirting like little tufts of vapor behind it.
Oh God, you need to make a 5-second film of this somehow. I think out of all these, Donald Glover would most likely actually do it. He's really plugged in to social media and cutting edge stuff. Like he was doing a lot of Twitter promotion for his new album. So I think if anyone's actually going to do it, I think you'll probably actually be able to buy Childish Gambino's album.
Yeah,
that's my guess.
Yeah.
I could believe that.
Yeah,
I can believe that. My question would be is like, how would a musician price this? Would they go, okay, I want my album is going to be like 0.08 Bitcoins, or would they say my album will be whatever the equivalent of $14.99 is in Bitcoin at the given moment that you elect to purchase it via Bitcoin?
Right now, the way the Bitcoin is and the way doing Bitcoin transaction is, it would most likely be you price it in dollars, somebody pays that equivalent in Bitcoin, and then they price it out. And there needs to be more companies like BitPay, which do that pretty much instantly for any merchant or for any artist if they wanted to, do that. There needs to be more companies like that so that becomes feasible. I mean, BitPay has incredible pricing where if you're a business or if you want to do 300 transactions a month, you're paying $30 to have instant Bitcoin to fiat, transactions. So you're not taking really any of the risk of Bitcoin with you.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's going to be awesome for people who have Bitcoins that are rap enthusiasts. I don't see this actually having any like widespread way to get people that aren't already Bitcoin enthusiasts more interested in purchasing things with Bitcoin.
I think it opens the door, and I think I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But I think you can look back and say Snoop Dogg is doing it, Childish Gambino is doing it. Why can't I do it? And I don't think it's going to happen immediately, but I think it's always good to set that precedent for Bitcoin.
Story number 2. It's one thing to buy an album with Bitcoin. It's a whole other thing to buy an expensive sports car. But someone has done that at Lamborghini of Newport Beach. They bought a Tesla S with Bitcoin. Also today, there's a rumor of someone buying an actual Lamborghini with Bitcoin, but we've yet to verify that story. So this kind of leads in from our previous one, and who in their right mind would spend Bitcoin right now, or why would a merchant accept Bitcoin?
I'll tell you, to me, this headline is like the 2013 equivalent of like 2001 man uses Segway to run Boston Marathon. This is like the most, like, this has so little bearing on anything like positive or negative about Bitcoins. This is a rich person who is a technophile doing something wacky for kicks.
It's sort of, but not really. I mean, there's a lot of new rich people from Bitcoin, obviously, but to compare it to Segway, I think is inaccurate in that Segway is in what industry? Bitcoin is in the finance industry, and there's still innovations to be made. And so it's slow adoption for merchants, but it's, again, a foot in the door. And it's somebody taking the lead in innovation and really seeing how purchasing something with Bitcoin works. And I mean, it seemed to go flawlessly for him.
I think I'm going to go with Ben on this one, and it's obviously a hype for Lamborghini of Newport Beach since they sold another car that way. It's also a great media story because it's like these guys who made these magic coins on their computer are now buying Lamborghinis. So
yeah,
and I'm not arguing that it's not something to get it's not a press grab, or it is a press grab. I'm not arguing against that, but it's also still they're still leading the way in the innovation for payments. And then to answer the more high level question of who in their right mind would spend to Bitcoin right now, I'm not really sure. I mean, the only people that would are people that have thousands or 10,000s of them that don't mind spending.
Or people
those,
that have
but
millions
right now,
of traditional dollars and are doing it purely for publicity purposes.
Yeah. Yeah. As far as
you know what? To me, I just think that this is hype. You know, this is kind of an unreal sort of bit of PR that has little to do with answering like the actual question or raising awareness of like how these could be useful to a broader segment of society besides, you know, a segment of technically savvy people with a lot of disposable income. You know, purchasing an absurdly expensive luxury car with a cryptocurrency, that doesn't even like qualify as a first world problem. That's like a 1/10 of the 1% world problem. Like, how do I buy my Tesla S with my Bitcoins? Lamborghini of Newport Beach is the only people that take them. Like this is the equivalent of like telling, you know, like try to explain this to someone who is like working minimum wage and they're just gonna blink at you and be like, okay.
Can you imagine
great.
trying to explain it to someone in the developing world too, not just minimum wage? Like
they would just be so mad at you.
Oh yeah, but
yeah, I still think the early adopters, they're grabbing press. It's a first world problem or whatever, but it's still they're testing out the legitimacy of purchasing something with Bitcoin. I mean, imagine what would he have to go through if he's purchasing this with fiat dollars. As far as all that stuff, he gets to just transport the money to them, 200 whatever, or how much is the Tesla?
Like $100,000.
Yeah, 80 to 100.
Whatever, 200. Yeah, whatever, however many Bitcoin he gives them the Bitcoin. They instantly have the Bitcoin right there, and he gets the car and he signs the paperwork.
Yeah,
and
but
it's over.
I mean, yes, but again, I think contrary to your point of like making a point, like we know that transactions can be made using Bitcoins. I don't think that's in question at all. But whether this one example of a wealthy individual buying an extremely expensive luxury item from a luxury item purveyor proves anything fundamental about the ability for Bitcoin to become a useful mode of exchange for the average person, I think is a bit of a leap. And more fundamentally, I don't think you can answer the question any better than I can, besides, just saying PR, as to why a business or why a user, depending on how they worked out that price. Although, as you pointed out in our earlier discussion, it was probably a set fiat, dollar price that was then converted instantly into Bitcoin. Why someone would buy, a Lambo or a Tesla with a Bitcoin, with a functional amount of Bitcoin that could and more than likely will appreciate in value in the coming weeks. It's like, well, look, nobody's buying a Lamborghini to be reasonable or thoughtful about their investments. Like, again, everything about this just reeks of
I think
PR.
Chris's point in that it's an interesting way to transfer a large amount of money. Like, that is difficult, right? Like, you can't.
Exactly. He transferred.
If you have enough, if you could go to a bank and get I'm not saying this is safe, but there are plenty of ways to transfer this amount of money if you have it on hand.
Chris's argument would be that
not true at all. Not nearly as easy as you could give somebody 200 Bitcoin. You cannot. The process of going and getting $90,000 from a bank versus the process of scanning a QR code is significantly different in every way. He's going to fill out paperwork in a bank.
No, he
he's
won't.
If
he's a high net worth individual that has, so if he bought a bunch of Bitcoins and effectively has the equivalent of, $90,000 in cash in Bitcoins, he could probably go to a bank and have a bearer bond or a cashier's check made out for that amount of money and walk it right down to the dealership and hand it to the dealer.
I think the majority of people that have wealth off Bitcoin do not have wealth in other manners. I think that most likely the larger percentage of people who own a lot of Bitcoin and are now wealthy paid, $1,000, and now they have over $1 million, well over $1 million. So I think I agree with your point that generally people are going to be wealthy if they own that much Bitcoin, or they're generally going to be wealthy if they buy a Lamborghini or a Tesla. I think in this instance, he's not going to be wealthy.
Yeah, but
I
would say that undermines your greater point.
I think you. Okay,
if it's about a freakish one-time person who made it, it's not like the gains on Bitcoin are going to continue like this
right.
at the pace. It's not like you're going to have millions and millions of more Bitcoin millionaires who buy in now and suddenly find their $800 investment or their $800 Bitcoin suddenly increasing by a factor of 20.
Yeah, we're pretty much out of time on this segment, guys. I think you both made some excellent points. I think the large amount of money, we'll just have to agree to disagree about that one and move on to our next segment. All right, that brings us to story 3. Apple is still not allowing Bitcoin apps. Apple initially allowed Coinbase's app and to be in the store for a few weeks. I actually still have it on my phone, but they pulled it a couple of weeks ago. And they recently pulled the Glyph app. That's gli.ph if you want to check it out. They can actually put theirs back up once they remove the ability to transfer Bitcoin because they have some other features, but Coinbase does not know when it'll be allowed back in. And so the question that brings up is Apple's lack of support for Bitcoin holding back adoption? And are they right to disallow these apps? Chris, we'll go with Chris first.
I don't think I think obviously as a company who controls all of iTunes and all of that, they are well within their rights. I don't think they are right. I think they're stifling innovation for their own benefit, which makes sense because they're a corporation, but I think it's ignorant and I think it's not forward thinking, and I dislike it, and I hate that they're, hurting Coinbase, who is a great innovative company who's helping to push Bitcoin forward into the future. I think overall it gives me a bad impression of Apple and gives everybody in the Bitcoin community, a bad impression of Apple. But again, I do think they're well within their rights to do it. I just hate that they're doing it.
What do you think, Ben? Why do you think they're doing this?
My assumption is they are most assuredly doing it out of a general conservative feeling towards the open regulatory question marks regarding it. Apple as a company is notoriously conservative in what they allow inside their ecosystems. And so I'm certain that they did a cost-benefit analysis from a legal standpoint on their side and said, with this being such a new thing, the risk that we run is unacceptable for the kind of risk calculation that we operate by. So it doesn't really surprise me at all. I don't think that there's any moral right or wrong to it. The idea that that allowing or disallowing, currency or commodity, however you want to look at Bitcoin trading on, a closed proprietary platform has some sort of moral right or wrong is pretty absurd. I would actually go so far as to say that I don't think it's having any real effect stifling, I don't think it's stifling innovation at this phase. If I can please finish, I would say that, Apple is the warm, friendly smartphone of your everyday user. And Bitcoin is still, despite its very impressive adoption gains and, explosion in the news, is still very, very far away from an everyday user kind of thing. I think actually Apple accepting Bitcoin transfer software will be more than anything a bellwether of Bitcoin's general acceptability from a legal and liability standpoint. Because I guarantee you there's no one in Apple saying we can't have these because we don't like Bitcoin. There's just a bunch of lawyers saying we don't really know how much trouble this might cause eventually. And because of that, we don't want to risk our giant mountain of money even a little. So let's just say no.
Apple has in-app purchases in a lot of their apps, and what they do is they take 30% from the purchases because they're allowing easy access for the developers. And I'm wondering if it has something to do with that, because they wouldn't be able to take a cut of their 30%.
No, they could. They could just say that the price of doing business in Bitcoin on Apple is cutting us 30%.
Right. But how do you do that with Bitcoin? Like, how would they? I think they probably haven't figured out how to grab their 30%.
Right, and
there's probably not an effective way to do that, and that probably played a role.
Yeah, let's Chris.
The only thing I take an issue with, I understand that it's clearly risky for them to accept that, and that their lawyers are like, no. But your point that it's not stifling the growth of Bitcoin at this point, I cannot agree with that at all, because what market penetration does the iPhone have? There's not one single Bitcoin killer app right now. There's not one app that everyone says, this is it. And they can't even get it onto the iPhone. They can't even try to get any app onto the iPhone. Is stifling innovation and is stifling the growth of Bitcoin. Let me finish. And to say Coinbase has a ridiculous number of users and a continuously growing number of users, and to not have an app allowed on the iPhone is absolutely killing Bitcoin's growth. They're one of 3 payment systems in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So if they're not allowed to have a app on iPhone, it is 100% killing the growth of Bitcoin. There's no arguing that.
I think I'm going to have to agree with Chris in that it is holding Bitcoin adoption a bit. I'm actually surprised they killed Coinbase because they're a pretty legit company.
Yeah.
They're not just like some third-party developer. But that being said, I totally agree. It's probably there's a legal aspect that they just don't want to get involved with.
I have to rebut that a little bit. The concept that like a killer app for Bitcoin on an iPhone is somehow going to speed adoption. What would a killer app that would get the average person utilizing a Bitcoin more be? What would that be?
If
exactly?
I knew I'd be a millionaire, if I knew I'd be a billionaire.
See, but that's kind of my point. At this phase, Apple if Apple does this 10 years, still doing this 10 years from now, and Bitcoin has blossomed in this big wonderful thing, then yes, it'll be stifling innovation. But in this phase, it's stifling essentially your convenience, and that's
still crushing.
And it's stifling the convenience of a very small community of enthusiasts. And by very small community of enthusiasts, I mean as compared to the users of any currency traded in the global market.
All right, Chris, go. What do you say?
I'm just saying you can't argue. You have to look at it from a relative term. Sure, you can compare it to Visa, you can compare it to any currency, forex exchange, but ultimately it's crushing the innovation of a small currency, and it needs every step it can get to grow. And crushing one of the biggest current areas where you can purchase and trade or sell Bitcoins is absolutely killing the innovation of Bitcoin right now. There can't be a question about that.
I think I'm going to have to be the moderator here and kind of split the difference. Ben is right in that it is super early, but Chris is also right in that if you can't iterate through these early versions, how do you find
the earlier it is, the more
I would argue
it is.
that philosophically Bitcoin needs to iterate a bit more before you start talking about apps that
you have to have those steps. You have to have those steps to grow, though. It's not going to grow without being able to.
Well, because couldn't they grow on Android as they're doing now and then port some of the learnings over to
You can grow
iOS?
on Android, you're just cutting out 50% of the cell phone market.
Sure, but I mean, ultimately, the point being is that it's not a question of like, damn, this Bitcoin app is super rad. I mean, basically what you do right now is you're using it for the purchasing of cryptocurrencies, right? I mean, like you said yourself, there isn't like a killer app for it yet. Right now, Bitcoins and cryptocurrency in general, the idea of a killer app that's somehow going to be available to 150 million people, you can't even tell me what 150 million people are going to use it for or why they would begin utilizing it. So my argument is that one day, yes, being blocked could be a problematic thing and could be considered stifling of innovation, but I would argue that the philosophical and like basic use case barriers for the average person haven't been figured out yet, and thus you're still like it's kind of like complaining that the next river over is the one blocking you. You've still got the river right in front of you that you need to cross.
All right, Chris, let's have one more rebuttal from you and then wrap up this segment.
Okay. Do you think it would have been better for the internet's growth if there was a preventative block to all the innovations and apps that were built on top of the internet protocol? Do you think the internet would have been better off with that, or it would have been better off without having any restrictions to the applications that could have been built and used upon it?
As my very quick reply to you on that, I would say that your question is the equivalent of like this complaint, if you want to use that metaphor, is basically it's like being in 1992 and complaining that I can't upload to an app store yet. Like
I'm assuming mass adoption.
But this isn't mass adoption. Like you're not at mass adoption at all. If it was mass adoption, this would be a completely different case. Right now, it's like there aren't a million people in the United States clamoring for the ability to trade bitcoins on
I'm just saying when the internet was small, it needed the ability to make tons of applications without any restrictions in order to grow. Bitcoin needs that same thing in order to grow.
And virtually no computers had the internet back then.
Okay.
So deal with your 50% Android share. Like
All right. Well, wow, that was way more intense than I thought it was going to be, but that was a great segment. All right, that brings us to story 4. Is Bitcoin worth exactly $1,300? Top Wall Street strategist David Wu tells us how it could be. Earlier this week, Wu, a strategist for Bank of America and Merrill Lynch, released an analysis of the potential fair price value of Bitcoin. It was based on several assumptions of adoption. It needs to one, account for at least 10% of all global e-commerce B2C transactions. 2, become one of the top 3 players in the money transfer industry, and 3, acquire a store of value reputation close to silver. Wu had a positive outlook for Bitcoin's future, stating, "We believe Bitcoin can become a major means of payment for e-commerce and may emerge as a serious competitor to traditional money transfer providers. As a medium of exchange, Bitcoin has clear potential for growth in our view." I don't think I even need a question, guys. Ben, what's your take on that?
Nothing about that seems unreasonable to me.
Bitcoin skeptic is saying it's reasonable.
No, but I will note that many of this analyst's points are gigantic ifs. 10% of all global e-commerce become like B2C, like business to consumer, becomes Bitcoin. So that's an enormous adoption level.
Yeah.
Huge. Top 3 players in the money transfer industry. I can't claim to know a god darn thing about that. And, I would assume, though, that is an equally large mountain to scale. And then the acquisition of a store of value reputation close to silver. Again, it's not, none of these things are impossible. But note that his price point for that his price point valuation for that is $1,300. And right now, Bitcoin has, in terms of its, e-commerce transaction, I would guess not even, a fraction of that 10%. And then those other points, it's not even vaguely on the road to those things happening yet. So I think what it indicates is that all that is very reasonable. But in that analysis, it means that the current valuation of Bitcoin is grossly inflated.
All right, Chris, what do you think?
And I just wonder, those are large hurdles to overcome to achieve a $1,300 fair price value. And the context is Bitcoin was at $1,200, $1,300 when he made this analysis, and is saying, for this to be true right now, this is what has to happen in Bitcoin. I wonder if is there political or strategic undertones or reasons for publishing this article? And I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist. I'm just saying, Bank of America, why would they make this public? Why would they make him publish this at this time? Why would he exactly say the fair price of Bitcoin is whatever and it needs to do this?
Do you think 1,300 is low and they're trying to keep it low?
I think they're trying to keep it lower. I think publishing that out in the public where everyone's going to read it, they're trying to make their profit off of Bitcoin. And I don't think that's an unreasonable assumption given Wall Street's nature to make profit. I think those are, if you take 10% of the global e-commerce industry, you think one Bitcoin's only going to be worth $1,300?
Well, no. That's not what he was saying, though. What he was saying is that as an instrument of trade. So, you're talking about, according to a quick search here, total e-commerce in 2012 globally was about $1 trillion. So he's talking in terms of transactions, about $100 billion worth of transactions in a year would take place in the form of Bitcoin transactions, which is not an unreasonable thing. And I would argue that, I can appreciate your concern on that. But honestly, I would take the fact that a Bank of America analyst publishing anything about Bitcoin and talking about real benchmarks is actually a very positive sign.
And that's one of the talking points is do we need to worry about that, or is that a positive thing?
It's a positive thing.
I think Wall Street taking note and even talking about it and taking the time, I agree, is an extremely positive thing. I just wonder about the price, the actual price he put out there.
Go ahead, sorry.
From what I can tell, as far as scourging the internet and reading people's thoughts about it, it's pretty much been dismissed, the $1,300, whether it's rational to dismiss it or not. It's pretty much been dismissed.
There's a lot of irrationality going on right now.
Certainly. I agree, but I'm just saying you have to take the free market into account. And if people are not valuing Bitcoin at $1,300, they think that's not a realistic evaluation, then his analysis, however mathematically accurate it may be, doesn't matter.
One thing he didn't mention, which I kind of wanted to talk about in this section, is potential competition of Bitcoin as it grows. There's a lot of altcoins out there right now, like Litecoin and Namecoin. Do you think these are legit potential competitors, or do you think these are just people riding the coattails? I'm gonna go with Chris on this first.
I like the gold to silver, Bitcoin to Litecoin comparison. As far as Bitcoin actually being replaced, I think it's going to take an immense marketing campaign to replace Bitcoin at this point. Even if it is small, I have a degree in marketing, not that I'm using that to argue from a position of authority, but the brand name of Bitcoin is extremely powerful, and to come up with an altcoin and say, oh yeah, I'm investing in this coin, people who are invested in Bitcoin right now think, oh, you're just trying to make your pump and dump money. Bitcoin is the first to market, and they have the brand power right now. And I think it's going to be extremely difficult, even if JP Morgan reiterates a patent, it's still going to be extremely difficult to overtake Bitcoin.
Yeah, Ben, you might have an interesting take on this. You have a friend who's getting way into these altcoins.
Yeah. I have a problem with this question in general.
Okay.
I think it's being asked I think it's being approached from the wrong angle. The idea that there's like some kind of zero-sum game being played with, cryptocurrencies, where there's, only a finite, amount of value to be extracted, and that there can only be either big players or little players, or, losers or winners in this, I think is not a really fruitful or thoughtful way to look at it. I think certainly there are definitely big competitors on the horizon, and there will be infinitely more of them in every passing year, especially as computational powers change. So that's one thing. Like, absolutely there will be competitors that do well, but I think more to the point, this question, the way you framed it, really drives to the heart of trying to figure out, what exactly Bitcoin is. If it's a commodity that's used as a medium of exchange, well, then people, once you prove that you can create something like this, there will undoubtedly be many competitors that will make custom-made instruments that will do a variety of different things that will bear some resemblance to Bitcoin one way or another, and they will be used for specific reasons. Alternately, if Bitcoin is, actually a currency, which I don't really think it is, even though that's kind of the way it's always presented.
Yeah, and I would like to talk about that one.
Sure, yeah. I don't think of Bitcoin's not a currency in any traditional sense, but if it becomes a currency, or that's the way its evolution goes, there's always room for more currencies. There's yen and euro, and before there were euros, there were a bajillion currencies there, and the dollar and
let's
everything
deal
else.
with that in our next story, because that one's, you're gonna have a lot of room to talk about currency versus commodity. Was there anything you want to reply to there, Chris?
Today, Matt Miller from the Bloomberg News, or Bloomberg, whatever it's called, basically, he asked a question on Reddit about just general questions, and somebody gave him the perspective of altcoins as tests. They're pretty much testing out the different ways Bitcoin could improve, and at any time, the core developers of Bitcoin could use those altcoins, could adopt that into the Bitcoin protocol to make Bitcoin a stronger currency. So, once they angled it that the altcoins are almost beta coins for Bitcoin to test and improve, and use as a test for a way to improve upon itself. So I thought that was pretty interesting and a new perspective on it.
That's a good point. All right, that was really good. We're going to have to wrap this section up, though. I'm just going to go ahead and move on to our final story, and that's China. That was definitely the big story. This week, the People's Bank of China, in coordination with other Chinese government ministries, made a ruling on Bitcoin and how it will be treated. The government ruled that Bitcoin may not be used by financial institutions as a monetary instrument and should not be considered a currency. The press release went on to call for stricter regulation of major Bitcoin exchanges and stipulated that while institutions cannot use Bitcoin, the people of China are still allowed to trade it as a virtual commodity. The market saw an initial sell-off, and Bitcoin lost about 20 to 25% of its value in a very short time. The market crashed further when the largest Chinese Bitcoin exchange, BTC China, which is also the largest exchange in the world, suddenly required all users to provide a Chinese ID to do any type of activity on the site. Many foreigners were unable to access funds, and panic selling on other exchanges ensued due to uncertainty of Bitcoin's future in China. However, since this incident, the market's recovered from a low at Bitstamp of $545 to around $800, $900 right now. So there's a couple different talking points here. You guys were hitting on it, which we haven't covered, but currency versus commodity. How do you guys see this? We'll go to Ben first, and then Chris.
Well, this is a little I think this is a little further from that question. I think that this is more indicative of two things. One, this is less a story about Bitcoin and more a story about China.
Is it? Do you think?
China,
Do you think it can be? Is it a story about government regulation in general of Bitcoin?
Only in the yes and no. More in the specific sense, it's a story about Chinese currency controls and the particulars of China's kind of unique command capitalist system and how it's controlled. Yeah. So taking lessons of how China decided to do things on kind of a micro level here and how it might be applied elsewhere. I don't think there's much to be taken from that. I mean, you can just see on the flip side of it, earlier the United States Senate, basically kind of gave it its blessing as something to like, yeah, we should continue to, kind of see where this goes. But on, in a darker round, yeah, this is very much what can happen when this is very much something that will happen again and again and again in less draconian and much more nuanced ways as Bitcoin becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm almost done, I swear to God. The fact that China did this is, again, should be taken in the same way as David Wu's analysis. It is a recognition of legitimacy. That said, these kinds of things will happen over and over and over again as it becomes more "quote unquote" legitimate, because that regulation will step in on that.
All right, Chris.
I agree. Real quickly on that is the way China does things, and I've read a couple interesting stories from people who live in China and are versed in the financial markets there. Is they build a fence around different new capital innovations and financial innovations for their own safety. But you're right that at first everyone panicked and sold and dropped the price to 500. But ultimately they saw that this is just how China does things, and they're being a prudent government, and they're protecting themselves, but they're also giving Bitcoin legitimacy. To draw to a higher level point, I did want to talk about the commodity versus currency thing, because I think it's one of the biggest drags on people who discuss or debate Bitcoin. Is people who are against Bitcoin always try to pin Bitcoin down as a currency, and I agree with you that it is not and should not be used as a currency right now. There's just simply no way that it can be considered a currency with its volatility. And what people who are pro-Bitcoin need to pay attention to and need to, the points they need to hammer home are the payment network, which is significantly improved upon the credit card network and every other payment system there's been. I just wanted to make that point that I don't consider it a currency at all right now, and that it's not smart from an economic perspective to try to argue that it's a currency right now.
Are the Chinese using it as a transfer, though, or are they seeing it as more of a commodity, an investment commodity to hold?
From what I understand and what I've read is that they're using it as a way to get around capital controls. The wealthy in China are using it as a way to get around capital controls. I'm not exactly sure why they need to do that or how they do that, but any alt currency or altcoin that pops up, apparently the wealthy in China need to or do use it as a way to control their wealth more to themselves versus the Chinese controlling.
Yeah, the reason I actually just saw these numbers, I don't have them in front of me, but there's a limit, I believe, of transferring out. I think they can only transfer $3,500 at a time out of the country and only $50,000 a year.
And I guess that makes sense as to why China was so quick and this was an unexpected ruling on Bitcoin. And I think they did this because anyone who's wealthy and wants to get their money into a different place, they're probably sending it through Bitcoin right now and shoving it out there all the way until China starts regulating it, which they're starting to do. And then another thing, and I think one of the talking points here is does government have the control of Bitcoin in their hands? And I think the governments right now, depending on their rulings, have a large say in what the value of Bitcoin is right now. And I mean that if you take it to one extreme and they outlaw it, Bitcoin's going to lose a lot of value. And if you take it to the other extreme and governments are like, we love Bitcoin, we're adopting it, it's going to gain a lot of value. So I think that governments have a huge play in this right now, and that that it's important for Bitcoin to make sure, or the people who discuss Bitcoin, the Bitcoin Foundation, make sure that they present Bitcoin in the best possible way and they are representing it accurately.
All right, Ben, any points on there?
No, I mean, fundamentally, it is about the capital control flight, and it's China is not a fully integrated member of the financial, worldwide financial society in the same way that, a citizen of the United States can, do various things with their money and, stocks and bonds and whatnot. So yeah, your notes about it being about capital controls or debt on the money. I think that, it's a little dramatic to say that governments can simply outlaw or fully embrace Bitcoin. I think that, if any of the last 10 years worth of financial screwing around showed the world is that any form of exotic financial instrument, good or bad, will likely be embraced by some government or some governments. And the real question is how do these instruments get regulated? How do they get tracked? And how do they get kind of viewed and handled by these governments? And that'll play a huge role in what they really become in the long run. Or in long run, I mean 10, 15, 20 years. I don't really disagree with anything that Chris said there.
The skeptic and the enthusiast agree. You got some common ground here.
The only thing I would point to as far as governments being able to control it is if governments have the authority to say, and I don't know if the United States government has exactly this authority, but if they were to say, no bank or credit union or anything can accept any, business to a Bitcoin exchange. And that could totally cut off all the Bitcoin exchanges because the Bitcoin exchanges rely on banks. And I saw this graph today where from November to December, the amount of the Chinese RMB or whatever their currency is 46% of the Bitcoin exchanges. The United States, the USD is 46% of the US exchanges, and then all the other currencies are those last few percentages, or 8%, I guess is what it is. And so if China says, listen, none of these exchanges or none of these banks can accept money from Bitcoin China, which is the largest exchange in the world, then that kills Bitcoin because the liquidity is not there anymore. So the governments do have, I would say, even if it seems dramatic, they do have a significant amount of power to cut it off.
Yeah, I don't disagree that they have a significant amount of power to cut it off, but in a situation like the United States or Western Europe, I think that, you're going to end up, if something like that were to happen, the form that it would take in the United States or Western Europe would be banking regulation rules that would then simply move Bitcoin, servers and exchanges out of the, say, mainstream boring banking industry, and they would be moved to, trading houses and, hedge funds and things like that, and they would just find a new home there. It would be no different than what they're trying to do with proprietary trading today with the Volcker rule and the reestablishment of those kinds of things. Or it might be as simple as a bank could only hold X percent of a Bitcoin liquidity to hedge against inherent risk.
Yeah, do you have anything real quick, Chris? Because we need to wrap this section up.
Are you saying that Bitcoin can exist outside of government regulation, significantly, or it's going to exist in just a smaller pocket or in a more niche pocket?
No, it won't exist outside of government regulation. But by the same token, there's no benefit for the United States or Western Europe to outlaw Bitcoin. How it is treated and the sort of
I agree with that.
Preferential valuation it has is what those regulations will decide. It's kind of the difference between the regulation could decide whether you could walk into a bank off the street one day and be like, hi, I need to convert $50,000 to Bitcoin. That might not be possible, but you might be able to get, an account with whatever the future version of Scottrade is and say, hey, I need to convert $50,000 to Bitcoin. And they're like, hey, no problem. Just, you need to put $50,000 in your, future Scottrade account. Because eventually, these transactions and things like that are going to become more tightly controlled and more tightly, kind of corralled into spaces versus just kind of right now where it's like, well, yeah, who the hell knows?
Yeah. Well, let's hope that ends up positively. Let's hope that ends up positively for Bitcoin.
All right. Well, that was great. And now Ben Geely with Today in Weird Things You Can Buy with Bitcoin.
All right. Today, for the low price of 2,313.72 Bitcoins, you could be the proud owner of the T206 Honus Wagner baseball card, widely considered one of the rarest baseball cards in existence. Honus Wagner was a famous dead ball era baseball player, and this was one of the original American Tobacco Company cards. These were small baseball cards that came in packs of rolling tobacco and chewing tobacco. That price is based on its most recent value at auction, sold in April of 2013. So go out there, and if you've got in excess of 2,300 Bitcoins, you too could be the proud owner of one of the rarest baseball cards in the world.
Or 10 Lamborghinis.
It's a lot more than 10 Lamborghinis.
All right, well, thank you very much for that, Ben. And that's it for this week of Bit Countdown. Catch us next week for more news and debate. Thanks for listening, and remember, always two-factor authenticate your Bitcoin accounts.
If you enjoyed the show you just listened to, visit letstalkbitcoin.com/contest and send 0.1 millibit or 0.0001 Bitcoin to the address indicated for that show. Thanks for helping.